The Winchester rifle cracked like thunder across the valley, and Brian Bennett dropped from his horse before the echo faded. Joyce Flores worked the lever action with practiced ease, brass cartridge spinning through morning air as she sighted the next target. Kyle Lopez spurred his mount behind a boulder, shouting orders that carried no authority anymore. The widow they had dismissed as easy prey now controlled the high ground, and their arrogance was about to cost them everything. 3 days earlier, Joyce had been just another struggling homesteader in the Montana Territory, training horses and mending fences on land that barely sustained her. Now she crouched behind granite outcropping, silver-streaked hair tied back, steel gray eyes tracking movement through her rifle scope. The woman who had buried her past with her husband was gone. What remained was something far more dangerous. Kyle Lopez pressed his back against stone, breathing hard. His remaining men, Thomas Morales and Scott Ramos, flanked him with growing uncertainty. They had come for one prize stallion. Instead, they faced someone who moved like smoke and shot like divine judgment. The tracks they followed had led them into a killing field, and the quiet widow had become their executioner. Joyce chambered another round, the metallic sound carrying across open ground. Her voice, when it came, held the calm of absolute certainty. "You had your warning," she called down to them. "Should have listened. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story gets more intense with every minute, and you will not want to miss what happens next." The nightmare had begun 72 hours ago when Joyce discovered Thunder missing from his paddock. Not just missing, stolen. The lock cut clean, hoof prints leading north toward the Badlands, and boot marks that told a story of professional thieves who knew exactly what they wanted. Thunder was no ordinary horse. The Black Stallion represented 5 years of careful breeding, her last connection to the ranch she and her late husband had built together, and the financial security that kept her independent. Joyce knelt beside the paddock fence, studying a sign the way most people read newspapers. 4 men, experienced riders, good boots. They had moved fast but not careful, confident that a widow alone posed no threat. The lead rider wore spurs with distinctive star rowels. She memorized the pattern, knowing she would need to identify it later. Standing slowly, Joyce brushed dust from her worn leather pants and walked toward the cabin. Her movements carried an economy that spoke of old habits, feet finding solid ground without conscious thought. Inside, she moved past the kitchen table where breakfast sat cooling, past the fireplace where her husband's photograph watched with kind eyes, and stopped before a cedar chest tucked beneath their bedroom window. The chest had not been opened since the funeral 3 years ago. Joyce lifted the heavy lid, revealing contents that transformed her from grieving widow to something altogether different. A federal marshal badge lay wrapped in oilcloth beside a Colt .45 with custom grips worn smooth by years of use. Beneath those, a leather-bound journal filled with wanted posters, territorial maps, and notes written in her careful hand. At the bottom, a telegram dated 1876 that read simply, "Assignment complete. Report to Denver for new posting." Marshal Joyce Whitman. She had been Marshal Joyce Whitman for 12 years before becoming Joyce Flores, wife to a gentle horse trainer who never asked about her past. Those 12 years hunting fugitives across 4 territories had taught her skills that peaceful widowhood had never erased. How to read tracks like scripture. How to move silent as shadow. How to put a bullet exactly where it needed to go from distances that defied belief. Joyce strapped on the gun belt, muscle memory guiding her hands through motions practiced 10,000 times. The weight felt familiar, comfortable, like greeting an old friend. She tucked the badge into her shirt pocket and selected ammunition from a hidden cache behind loose floorboards. 40 rounds of .45 caliber Justice, each one hand-loaded for accuracy. When outside, she saddled Sage, her gray mare trained for silence and endurance. The horse stood patient while Joyce secured rifle, provisions, and rope to the saddle. As she mounted, Joyce caught her reflection in the cabin window. The woman looking back was someone she had not seen in years. Hard eyes, set jaw, hands that rested easy on weapon grips. The widow was gone. The marshal had returned. The trail led north through pine forest and rocky draws, clear as highway signs to someone who knew how to read them. Joyce followed at steady pace, noting where the thieves had stopped to rest, where they had watered their horses, how they moved with confidence born of successful raids. These were not desperate men making foolish choices. They were professionals who had studied their target and found her wanting. That would be their mistake. By midday, Joyce reached the edge of her territory and paused to study the landscape ahead. The tracks continued into Badlands controlled by no law but strength and cunning. Perfect country for men who lived outside civilization. Also perfect country for someone who knew how to use terrain as weapon. She dismounted and examined the ground more carefully. The lead rider's star rowel spurs had left distinctive marks in soft earth beside a creek. Joyce sketched the pattern in her journal, adding notes about gait and horse size. Professional habits died hard, and she had learned long ago that details saved lives. A mile further north, she found their first camp. Cold ashes, horse droppings, and something that made her blood run cold. Thunder's black tail hair caught on a thorn bush, pulled out by stress or rough handling. The stallion was frightened, fighting his captors. That meant they were using harsh methods to control him, possibly injuring the animal she had raised from foal. Joyce remounted with grim purpose. The hunt was no longer just about recovering stolen property. It was about making thieves pay for cruelty to something she loved. This trail wound higher into country where pine gave way to aspen and grod. Joyce knew this territory from her martial days when she had tracked the Brennan gang through these same draws. Every ridge, every hidden pass, every source of water was cataloged in memory, sharpened by years of pursuit. The thieves might know horses, but they did not know this land like she did. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Joyce heard voices carried on wind from the valley ahead. She dismounted and ground-tied sage, then moved forward on foot with rifle in hand. Through screen of pine boughs, she saw their camp beside a natural spring. 4 men exactly as the tracks had indicated. Good horses, professional gear. And Thunder, magnificent even in captivity, tied with rope that chafed his neck raw. The men lounged around a small fire, confident in their isolation. Joyce studied each face through her rifle scope, memorizing features and noting weapons. The leader was a big man with silver beard and expensive boots. Brian Bennett, she realized, recognizing him from wanted posters. Horse thief and worse, operating across 3 territories with a gang that included his brother Paul Richardson. But Paul was not among the men below. Only Bennett, Kyle Lopez, Thomas Morales, and Scott Ramos. 4 against 1, in country they thought they controlled. Joyce smiled without humor. She had faced worse odds with less preparation. She watched until sunset, learning their routines and guard rotations. Bennett was careful but not paranoid. He posted 1 man on watch while the others slept, changing guards every 3 hours. Professional but predictable. Joyce noted how they moved, where they kept weapons, which man seemed most alert. All information that would matter when the time came. As darkness fell, Joyce withdrew to her own cold camp a half-mile distant. No fire, no hot food, just jerky and water, while she planned her approach. 4 men meant she needed advantages beyond simple marksmanship. Surprise, terrain, and their own overconfidence would have to be enough. She cleaned her rifle by moonlight, checking action and sight alignment. The Winchester had served her well during martial years, accounting for 7 fugitives who chose bullets over surrender. Tonight it would serve again. Joyce woke before dawn, moving silent through pre-dawn darkness toward the thieves' camp. She had circled wide during night, approaching from high ground that overlooked their position. The spring that provided their water also created a natural bottleneck, with steep walls on 3 sides. Perfect for men who wanted security, also perfect for someone who wanted to trap them. She positioned herself among granite boulders 60 yards above their camp, with clear sight lines and multiple escape routes. The Winchester rested steady on stone, loaded and ready. Joyce settled into wait, patient as death itself. Below, the camp stirred to life as gray dawn touched the valley. Thomas Morales built up the fire while Scott Ramos checked the horses. Kyle Lopez emerged from his bedroll cursing the cold, and Brian Bennett stood stretching muscles stiff from sleeping on hard ground. None of them looked up toward the high ground where death waited with infinite patience. Joyce watched Bennett approach Thunder, running rough hands over the stallion's flanks and legs. The horse shied away, ears pinned back in fear and anger. When Bennett jerked the lead rope hard enough to make Thunder stumble, Joyce felt her finger tighten on the trigger. Not yet. Patience was a weapon too. The thieves broke camp slowly, arguing about the best route north toward the border. Bennett wanted to push hard for the territorial line. Lopez preferred to move careful and avoid attention. Neither man considered that they might already be found. As they prepared to mount up, Joyce made her decision. Time to announce herself properly. Her first shot took the coffee pot off the fire, spraying hot liquid across the camp. The second shot, fired before the echo of the first had faded, punched through Bennett's hat and sent it spinning into the creek. Four men dove for cover, shouting questions that had no good answers. "Joyce Flores," Joyce called down to them, her voice carrying clearly in morning air. "United States Marshal, retired. You took something that belongs to me." The silence that followed stretched long enough for understanding to sink in. These were not stupid men. They knew what a federal marshal meant, even a retired one. More importantly, they knew what those two shots meant. Someone with that kind of accuracy from that distance could have killed them all instead of delivering a warning. Bennett recovered first, pressing himself against a boulder while scanning the high ground. "Where are you, Marshal?" he called back. "Let us talk this through like civilized people." Joyce worked the lever action, chambering a fresh round. The metallic sound carried clearly in thin air. "You had your chance to be civilized," she replied. "Should have thought of that before you stole my horse." Kyle Lopez tried to move toward better cover, and Joyce put a bullet 6 inches from his boot. He froze instantly, understanding that his life hung on her mercy. The next shot might not be a warning. "We can make a deal," Bennett shouted. "Horse is worth good money. We split it fair." Joyce almost laughed. These men still thought this was about money. They had no idea they had awakened something that should have stayed buried. "The horse is not for sale," she called back, "and neither am I." Thomas Morales, youngest of the gang, made the mistake of reaching for his rifle. Joyce put her next shot through the weapon's stock, splintering wood and sending him scrambling away empty-handed. The message was clear. She could have killed him just as easily. Scott Ramos tried a different approach. "Lady, you are making a big mistake," he yelled. "We got friends coming. You best ride away while you still can." Joyce smiled grimly. Empty threats from men who thought numbers mattered more than skill. She had faced entire gangs during her martial years, learning that fear was often more effective than bullets. "Let them come," she called back. "I have enough ammunition for everyone." Bennett was growing desperate, realizing that his tactical situation was hopeless. They were pinned down in low ground with limited cover, facing someone who commanded the high ground and shot with supernatural accuracy. Every option led to death or capture. "What do you want, Marshal?" he called. "My horse," Joyce replied simply. "Your surrender, justice for whatever other crimes you have committed in my territory." "Your territory," Lopez laughed bitterly. "This is open country, lady. No law out here but what we make." Joyce sighted carefully and put her next bullet through the brim of his hat. "Wrong," she said quietly. "I am the law here. Have been for 12 years, and 3 years of retirement did not change that." The truth was sinking in now. They had not just stolen from a widow. They had stolen from someone who had spent years hunting men exactly like them. Someone who knew their tricks, their hideouts, their methods. Someone who would not stop until justice was served. Bennett made his choice. He broke cover, running toward the horses with desperate speed. Joyce tracked him smoothly, leading the target, accounting for distance and wind. Her shot took him high in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him hard. Not a killing shot, but one that ended his escape attempt permanently. The remaining 3 men huddled behind inadequate cover, understanding finally that they were outmatched. Joyce had demonstrated her capabilities clearly. She could kill them whenever she chose. The only question was whether they would surrender or force her to finish this the hard way. Kyle Lopez made the decision for all of them. He stood slowly, hands raised, stepping clear of his cover. "I surrender, Marshal," he called. "Do not shoot." Thomas Morales and Scott Ramos followed his example, emerging with hands high and weapons discarded. They had seen enough to know that fighting would only get them killed. Better to take their chances with territorial justice than face this woman's rifle again. Joyce kept them covered while she descended from her position, moving carefully but confidently. The Winchester never wavered from its targets. When she reached the camp, she directed them to sit together while she checked on Bennett. The wounded man was conscious but pale, blood seeping through fingers pressed to his shoulder. Joyce examined the wound with professional detachment. Clean through and through, missing bone and major vessels. He would live to stand trial. You are under arrest, she told them formally. Horse theft, operating criminal enterprise, resisting federal authority. Kyle Lopez, you are wanted in Colorado territory for armed robbery. Thomas Morales, there is a warrant for you in Wyoming territory for cattle rustling. Scott Ramos, you have outstanding charges in Dakota territory for assault. The men stared at her in amazement. How could she know their names, their crimes, their histories? Joyce smiled without warmth. Once a marshal, always a marshal, she explained. I keep track of wanted men in my territory. She secured them with rope from their own gear, professional knots that would not slip or cut circulation. Bennett needed medical attention, but he would survive long enough to reach the territorial marshal in Helena. Justice would be served, just not the kind they had expected when they decided to steal from a lonely widow. Thunder stood quietly as Joyce approached, recognizing her scent and voice. The stallion was unharmed beyond rope burns and stress, but his eyes held the wildness of recent fear. Joyce spoke softly while checking him over, hands gentle on his neck and flanks. The horse gradually relaxed under her touch, understanding that safety had returned. The journey back to her ranch took 2 days, with Joyce leading the prisoners and their horses while keeping Thunder close beside her. She rode alert but relaxed, confident in her abilities and the security of her captives. The men had learned respect for her skills and showed no inclination to test them further. On the first night, camped beside a clear stream, Kyle Lopez finally asked the question that had been eating at him. How did you know, Marshal? About our names, our crimes? We never met you before. Joyce looked up from cleaning her rifle, considering how much to reveal. 12 years hunting fugitives teaches you to remember faces and names, she said finally. Your descriptions were in every marshal station from here to California. I just never expected you to come to me. She did not mention the extensive files she maintained, the correspondence with other marshals, the network of information that had made her one of the most effective lawmen in the territories. Some secrets were better kept. Brian Bennett, his shoulder bandaged, an arm in a makeshift sling, spoke for the first time since his capture. You could have killed us all, he said quietly. Why did you not? Joyce met his eyes steadily. Because I am not an executioner, she replied. Justice means trial and sentence, not murder. You will face the law properly. But you would have killed us if we had not surrendered, Thomas Morales pressed. Joyce nodded without hesitation. If you had forced that choice, yes. A marshal's duty is to bring in fugitives alive when possible, dead when necessary. You chose alive. The second day brought them within sight of her ranch, and Joyce felt something settle in her chest that had been tight since discovering Thunder missing. Home looked exactly as she had left it, peaceful and quiet in afternoon sunlight. But something fundamental had changed. She was no longer hiding from her past. At the ranch, Joyce secured the prisoners in a root cellar, a stone-lined chamber that would hold them safely until the territorial marshal arrived. She sent word to Helena via a neighbor who rode for the telegraph office, requesting immediate pickup of 4 federal fugitives. The response came back within hours. Marshal Paul Richardson would arrive within the week. Paul Richardson, Joyce smiled grimly at the irony. Brian Bennett's own brother was the territorial marshal who would take him to trial. Justice sometimes had a sense of humor. While waiting for official law enforcement, Joyce settled back into ranch routines with a difference. She no longer hid her weapons or buried her past. The Colt rode openly on her hip, and the Winchester rested within easy reach. Word had spread through the territory that the quiet widow was actually a retired federal marshal, and that news brought both respect and caution from neighbors who had previously offered unwanted help or advice. Hannah Diaz, who owned the nearest ranch 5 miles south, rode over the day after Joyce returned. The older woman had always been friendly but distant, respecting Joyce's preference for solitude. Now she approached with obvious curiosity and perhaps a touch of awe. So it is true, Hannah said without preamble. You really are a federal marshal. Joyce looked up from repairing Thunder's damaged halter. Was, she corrected, retired 3 years ago when I married Robert. But you still have the authority, Hannah pressed. The skills. Joyce set down her tools and met the other woman's eyes. The skills never leave, she said quietly. The authority is more complicated. I acted within my rights to recover stolen property and apprehend known fugitives. Whether the territorial government agrees remains to be seen. Hannah nodded slowly. There have been rumors, she said. Other ranchers losing stock, travelers robbed on the northern trails. People are saying Bennett's gang was responsible for more than horse theft. Joyce was not surprised. Professional criminals rarely limited themselves to single crimes. Bennett and his men had probably been operating across the territory for months, taking advantage of sparse law enforcement and vast distances between settlements. Her intervention had likely prevented future crimes as well as recovering her property. The territorial marshal arrived 6 days later, accompanied by 2 deputies and a prison wagon. Paul Richardson was a tall man with graying hair and tired eyes, worn down by years of chasing criminals across impossible distances. Joyce met him at her front gate, wearing her badge openly for the first time in 3 years. Marshal Richardson, she said formally, I have 4 federal fugitives in custody, including your brother. Paul Richardson studied her with professional interest. Marshal Flores, he replied. Or should I say Marshal Whitman? Your reputation preceded you even into retirement. Joyce felt a moment of surprise. She had not expected to be recognized after 3 years of obscurity. Her record was known among law enforcement, but she had hoped for anonymity in civilian life. I kept track of the best marshals in my territory, Richardson explained. When you disappeared after your marriage, I wondered if you had really retired or just moved your operations. This answers that question. He examined her prisoners with satisfaction, noting their condition and the quality of their restraints. Professional work, he observed. Clean captures, minimal violence, proper documentation. You have not lost your edge. Joyce felt something she had not experienced in years. Professional recognition from a peer. Acknowledgement that her skills remained sharp despite retirement. It was gratifying in ways she had not expected. The transfer of prisoners went smoothly, with Joyce providing detailed reports on their crimes and the circumstances of their capture. Richardson reviewed her documentation with approval, noting the thoroughness and accuracy that had made her legendary among territorial lawmen. Your brother will receive fair trial, Joyce assured him as Bennett was loaded into the prison wagon. Paul Richardson nodded grimly. He made his choices, Marshal. Justice will take its course. As the wagon pulled away, carrying the men who had violated her peace, Joyce felt a chapter closing. The immediate threat was ended, the criminals captured, her property recovered. But something larger had changed. The careful separation between her past and present was gone forever. Word of the capture spread quickly through the territory, carried by travelers and telegraph lines to every settlement and ranch. The story grew in the telling, as such stories do, until Joyce Flores became a figure of legend. The quiet widow who had revealed herself as one of the most effective federal marshals in territorial history, the woman who had single-handedly captured an entire criminal gang. With fame came complications. Visitors arrived at her ranch seeking everything from autographs to advice to requests for help with their own problems. Joyce found herself reluctantly thrust into a public role she had never wanted. The peaceful anonymity of widowhood was gone, replaced by recognition that brought both respect and unwanted attention. Laura Ward, editor of the territorial newspaper, wrote out from Helena 3 weeks after the arrests. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s, with ink-stained fingers and the persistent manner of someone accustomed to getting answers. Joyce received her politely but warily, unsure how much of her story she wanted made public. The people deserve to know about heroes, Laura said, settling into a chair on Joyce's front porch. Your story gives hope to everyone who feels powerless against criminals. Joyce poured coffee and chose her words carefully. I am not a hero, she said. I was just a woman who wanted her horse back. Laura laughed. Marshal Whitman, you tracked 4 armed men across hostile territory and captured them single-handed. That sounds like heroism to most people. The use of her old name made Joyce wince slightly. She had grown comfortable as Joyce Flores, wife and widow. Marshal Whitman belonged to a different life, one she had thought permanently buried. What will you do now? Laura asked. Return to active duty, take on private cases. The territory needs someone with your skills. Joyce had been asking herself the same question for weeks. The badge in her pocket seemed heavier than it should, weighted with memories and possibilities. She had tasted action again, felt the satisfaction of justice served and criminals punished. But she had also remembered the loneliness of the trail, the constant danger, the weight of responsibility that came with federal authority. I have not decided, she said finally. This was personal. Someone stole from me, and I took back what was mine. That does not necessarily mean I want to return to law enforcement. But the territory needs you, Laura pressed. Marshal Richardson is overwhelmed, understaffed, covering more ground than any three men should handle. Crime is increasing as more settlers arrive and more criminals follow them. You could make a real difference. Joyce sipped her coffee and stared across her land toward the mountains where she had hunted Bennett's gang. The work was important, necessary, satisfying in ways that ranching never quite matched. But it was also dangerous, demanding, likely to end in violence more often than not. I will consider it, she said finally, but I make no promises. After Laura left, Joyce found herself walking the boundaries of her ranch, thinking about futures she had not considered in 3 years. The land was beautiful, peaceful, profitable enough to support her modest needs. But it was also isolated, limiting, perhaps too small for someone accustomed to ranging across entire territories in pursuit of justice. That evening, she sat on her porch reading a letter that had arrived with the afternoon mail. It was from Marshal Richardson, formally thanking her for her assistance and making an offer that did not surprise her. The territorial government was prepared to reactivate her commission, he wrote. Full authority, competitive salary, choice of assignments within the Montana Territory. The work was important, the need genuine, the opportunity to serve justice compelling. Joyce folded the letter and watched stars emerge in the darkening sky. 3 years ago, she had buried her badge with her husband, choosing love over duty, peace over purpose. Now circumstances had forced her to choose again, and the decision felt heavier than it should. Thunder nickered softly from his paddock, content in familiar surroundings. The stallion had recovered fully from his ordeal, showing no lasting effects from his brief captivity. He was magnificent in moonlight, black coat gleaming, muscles rippling beneath perfect conformation. Worth stealing, certainly. Worth fighting for, absolutely. But was he worth returning to a life of violence and danger? Joyce rose and walked to the paddock fence, running her hands along Thunder's neck while he nuzzled her shoulder. The horse represented everything she had built with Robert, their dreams and plans and careful breeding programs. Losing him would have meant losing the last connection to the life they had shared. Yet recovering him had required skills and instincts that belonged to Marshall Whitman, not Joyce Flores. The woman who had tracked Bennett's gang and captured them was not the same woman who trained horses and mended fences. She was someone harder, more dangerous, more alive in ways that peaceful widowhood had never provided. A week later, Joyce made her decision. She rode to Helena wearing her badge openly, the Colt on her hip and the Winchester in its saddle scabbard. Marshal Richardson met her at the Federal Building with obvious satisfaction. "Welcome back, Marshal Whitman," he said formally. "The territory is safer with you on duty." Joyce accepted the paperwork that reactivated her commission, signing documents that made her return official. But she had one condition that surprised her new superior. "I keep the ranch," she said firmly. "It remains my base of operations, my home between assignments. I will not give up everything I built with my husband." Richardson agreed readily. A marshal with local ties was often more effective than one who remained rootless and transient. Joyce's ranch would provide stability and connection to the community she served. Her first assignment came within days. Reports of cattle rustling in the northern valleys, organized theft that suggested professional criminals rather than desperate amateurs. The kind of case that required patience, skill, and the willingness to track fugitives across difficult terrain. Joyce saddled Thunder and loaded her gear with the efficiency of long practice. The stallion seemed to sense the change in routine, stepping with energy and alertness that spoke of anticipated adventure. Horse and rider were partners again in more than training. As she rode north from her ranch toward unknown dangers, Joyce felt the satisfaction of purpose restored. She was no longer hiding from her past or denying her nature. The widow and the marshal were the same woman, integrated at last into someone who could find peace in justice and strength in service. The cattle rustling case led Joyce into the high country north of her ranch, where summer grazing lands provided rich pickings for organized thieves. The stolen herds were being driven toward the Canadian border through passes that only experienced guides could navigate. Joyce followed sign that grew fresher with each mile, knowing she was closing on criminals who had no idea they were being hunted. On the third day of tracking, she encountered Hannah Gonzalez, a young woman whose family ranch had lost 50 head of prime breeding stock. Hannah rode a paint mare with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, and her eyes held the determined anger of someone who had been wronged. "Marshal Whitman," Hannah called as she approached Joyce's position beside a mountain stream. "I heard you were tracking the rustlers. My family wants to help." Joyce studied the younger woman carefully. Hannah was perhaps 25, with calloused hands and the weathered complexion of someone who worked outdoors. Her rifle was well maintained and her horse showed the conditioning of hard use. She might be useful, or she might be a liability. "This is federal business," Joyce said carefully. "Dangerous work for trained law enforcement." Hannah's jaw set stubbornly. "Those cattle represented 3 years of careful breeding, Marshal. My family's future. We have the right to pursue our property." Joyce recognized the determination in Hannah's voice because she had felt it herself when Thunder was stolen. The need for justice, for recovery of what was taken, for the satisfaction of making thieves pay for their crimes. It was not something easily denied or dismissed. "You can ride with me," Joyce decided, "but you follow orders without question. This is not about revenge. It is about law enforcement." Hannah nodded eagerly, falling into position beside Joyce as they continued north. The younger woman proved to be an excellent tracker in her own right, reading sign with skills learned from childhood, spent following cattle across open range. She also knew the local terrain intimately, providing information about water sources and hidden trails that would prove valuable. As they climbed higher into mountain country, Joyce found herself enjoying the partnership. Hannah was competent, careful, and refreshingly direct in her approach to problems. She reminded Joyce of herself at that age, full of energy and determination to make the world more just. The Rustler's Trail led through a high pass that opened onto Hidden Valley, perfect for holding stolen cattle. Joyce and Hannah approached carefully, using terrain and vegetation to mask their advance. Through field glasses, Joyce counted at least 30 head of mixed cattle-bearing brands from 3 different ranches. The thieves had been busy. More importantly, she counted 5 men guarding the herd. Professional operation, well-organized and carefully planned. These were not desperate amateurs, but experienced criminals who knew their business. The kind of men who would fight rather than surrender. Joyce studied their positions and routines, noting guard rotations and weapon placements. The rustlers had chosen their ground well, with clear sight lines and limited approaches. A direct assault would be costly and possibly futile. Better to use patience and superior tactics. "We wait for dark," Joyce told Hannah. "Then we even the odds." As sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Joyce outlined her plan. Hannah would circle wide to the north, positioning herself to cut off escape routes through the high pass. Joyce would approach from the south, using darkness and surprise to capture or eliminate the guards one by one. It was dangerous work requiring split-second timing and absolute trust between partners. Hannah listened carefully, asking questions that showed tactical understanding beyond her years. When Joyce finished, the younger woman nodded grimly. "I understand, Marshal. We do this clean and professional." Joyce felt a moment of pride in her temporary partner. Hannah had the instincts and attitude of a natural law officer. Perhaps after this case was resolved, she might consider a more permanent arrangement. As full darkness settled over the valley, the 2 women moved to their positions with the silence of experienced hunters. Joyce approached the rustlers' camp from downwind, using shadows and terrain to mask her advance. The criminals had grown careless in their hidden valley, posting only 1 guard while the others slept around a small fire. Joyce took the sentry with a sleeper hold that left him unconscious but breathing. She secured him with rope and moved toward the next target, a man sleeping apart from the others with his rifle within easy reach. Another silent takedown, another criminal neutralized without violence. The remaining 3 men proved more challenging. One woke as Joyce approached, reaching for his weapon with desperate speed. Joyce was faster, her Colt clearing leather and firing before he could bring his rifle to bear. The shot echoed across the valley like thunder, waking the remaining rustlers and turning stealth into open combat. Hannah's rifle cracked from the north rim, her bullet taking down a man who tried to reach the horses. Joyce rolled behind a boulder as return fire sparked off stone around her. Two rustlers remained active, both experienced gunmen who used cover effectively and shot with dangerous accuracy. The firefight lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. Joyce used superior position and marksmanship to keep the criminals pinned, while Hannah prevented their escape. When the shooting ended, 3 rustlers were dead and 2 captured alive, along with all the stolen cattle and evidence of their organized operation. Hannah descended from her position with obvious satisfaction, checking the captured men for weapons while Joyce examined their gear for clues about other crimes. Professional equipment, good horses, substantial cash reserves. This gang had been operating successfully for months, possibly years. Marshal Richardson arrived 2 days later with a full posse to transport prisoners and recovered cattle back to their owners. He surveyed the scene with professional approval, noting the tactical efficiency and minimal collateral damage. "Outstanding work, Marshal Whitman," he said formally. "Clean operation, good intelligence, proper procedures followed throughout." Joyce accepted the praise but found herself looking toward Hannah, who was helping load prisoners into the transport wagon. The younger woman had performed exceptionally under pressure, showing courage and competence that impressed even experienced lawmen. Marshal Richardson noticed Joyce's attention and followed her gaze to Hannah. "That young woman has potential," he observed. "Natural instincts, good judgment under fire. Have you considered recruitment?" Joyce had been thinking the same thing. The Territorial Marshal Service was chronically understaffed, and qualified candidates were rare. Hannah possessed the skills and temperament for law enforcement, plus intimate knowledge of local terrain and communities. She would be a valuable addition to their ranks. "Hannah," Joyce called, "a word with you." The younger woman approached with curiosity, wiping dust from her hands after securing the last of the recovered cattle. "Yes, Marshal. How would you feel about making this work permanent?" Joyce asked directly. "The territorial government needs deputy marshals. You have the skills and the temperament." Hannah's eyes widened with surprise and interest. "You mean become a real lawman? Carry a badge and federal authority?" Joyce nodded. "Full commission, competitive salary, choice of assignments within reason. The work is dangerous but important. The territory needs people who understand justice and are willing to fight for it." Hannah looked toward the mountains where they had tracked rustlers and fought gun battles, then back at Joyce with growing excitement. "When do I start?" she asked. The paperwork took 3 weeks to process, during which Joyce returned to her ranch to handle routine business and prepare for future assignments. Thunder had performed magnificently during the mountain chase, showing stamina and sure-footedness that justified years of careful breeding. Joyce was proud of both horse and rider, partners in the pursuit of justice. Hannah's commission arrived with the morning mail, along with a new assignment that would test both marshals' skills. Reports of a confidence scheme operating in mining towns across the territory, sophisticated fraud that was bilking honest settlers out of life savings. The criminals were educated, organized, and extremely careful about avoiding law enforcement. Perfect case for 2 marshals who could blend into communities without attracting attention. Joyce would pose as a widow looking to invest her late husband's insurance money. Hannah would play her niece, recently arrived from back east with inheritance to spend. Together, they would infiltrate the confidence ring and gather evidence for prosecution. The assignment took them to Silver Creek, a booming mining town where recent gold strikes had attracted fortune seekers from across the country. The perfect environment for confidence men who preyed on greed and desperation. Joyce and Hannah registered at the town's best hotel, playing their roles as wealthy women looking for investment opportunities. Within 2 days, they were approached by Thomas Morales, a smooth-talking man in expensive clothes who claimed to represent exclusive mining ventures. Joyce recognized him immediately as one of the rustlers she had captured months earlier, apparently released on bail and returned to criminal activity. The irony was almost amusing. "Ladies," Morales said with practiced charm, "I understand you are looking for investment opportunities. I represent some very promising claims that might interest sophisticated investors like yourselves." Joyce played her role perfectly, expressing interest while asking intelligent questions that established her credibility as a serious investor. Hannah followed her lead, portraying enthusiasm tempered by appropriate caution. Together, they convinced Morales that they were exactly the kind of wealthy marks his operation targeted. The confidence scheme was elaborate and well-planned. Morales introduced them to Lisa Morgan, supposedly a successful mine owner who had struck it rich through careful investment. Lisa showed them falsified documents, staged mine tours, and testimonials from satisfied investors who were actually part of the criminal organization. Joyce documented everything carefully, building a case that would convict the entire ring once arrests were made. The scheme involved at least 8 criminals operating across 4 towns, defrauding victims of thousands of dollars through fake mining investments. Professional operation that required careful coordination and substantial resources. After a week of investigation, Joyce had enough evidence to move against the confidence ring. She sent word to Marshal Richardson requesting support for simultaneous raids in multiple locations. The response came back within hours. Federal marshals would coordinate arrests across the territory, striking at dawn to prevent communication between criminal cells. The night before the raids, Joyce and Hannah prepared their weapons and reviewed arrest procedures. They would take Morales and Morgan at the hotel, while other marshals hit targets in neighboring towns. Timing would be critical to prevent escapes and preserve evidence. As dawn broke over Silver Creek, Joyce knocked on Morales's hotel room door with Hannah positioned to cover the back exit. "Federal marshals," she announced. "You are under arrest." The door opened to reveal Morales in nightclothes, his face showing recognition and resignation. "Marshal Whitman," he said quietly, "I should have known better than to try confidence schemes in your territory." Joyce secured him with handcuffs while Hannah arrested Lisa Morgan in the adjoining room. Both criminals surrendered without resistance, understanding that their elaborate scheme had been thoroughly penetrated and documented. The evidence Joyce had gathered would ensure lengthy prison sentences for all involved. Marshal Richardson arrived that afternoon with reports from other arrest sites. The entire confidence ring had been rolled up successfully, with 8 criminals in custody and substantial stolen money recovered for return to victims. Another professional operation dismantled through careful investigation and coordinated law enforcement. "Outstanding work again, Marshal Whitman," Richardson said with obvious satisfaction. "Your undercover work provided the intelligence we needed to break this case completely." Joyce accepted the praise but found herself looking forward to returning home to her ranch. The confidence case had required weeks of deception and role-playing that left her feeling disconnected from her true self. She preferred the honest directness of tracking criminals across open country to the subtle manipulation required for undercover work. Hannah seemed to thrive on the variety, equally comfortable with mountain gunfights and sophisticated fraud investigations. She was developing into an exceptional law officer, combining natural instincts with growing experience and training. Joyce felt pride in her protégé's rapid development. The journey home took them through country Joyce had not seen in months, territory she had once patrolled as solitary marshal before taking on a partner. The landscape looked different somehow, less lonely and more manageable with Hannah riding beside her. Partnership had advantages beyond simple tactical support. They stopped for the night beside a clear stream where Joyce had camped many times during her earlier career. The spot held memories of long hunts and difficult cases, victories and failures that had shaped her understanding of justice and law enforcement. Sharing those stories with Hannah felt like passing on something valuable. "You have learned quickly," Joyce told her partner as they sat beside their small fire. "Most deputies take years to develop the instincts you show naturally." Hannah poked at the coals with a stick, considering her response. "I had a good teacher," she said finally. "Someone who showed me that law enforcement is about more than just badges and guns. It is about protecting people who cannot protect themselves." Joyce nodded, recognizing her own philosophy reflected in Hannah's words. The work was important precisely because it served something larger than personal ambition or desire for excitement. Justice mattered because injustice caused real harm to real people. "What will you do next?" Hannah asked. "Return to the ranch? Take another assignment? You seem restless lately." Joyce had been asking herself the same question. The ranch remained her home and sanctuary, but it no longer felt like enough. She had tasted partnership and found it satisfying in ways that solitary work had never provided. Perhaps it was time to consider permanent arrangements. "I have been thinking about establishing a regional office," Joyce said carefully. Base of operations for multiple marshals covering the Northern Territories. Headquarters at my ranch, with deputies assigned to specific districts. Hannah's eyes lit with interest. You mean like a real law enforcement agency? Multiple marshals working together instead of alone? Exactly, Joyce confirmed. Better coordination, shared intelligence, mutual support during difficult cases. The territory is growing too large and complex for individual marshals operating in isolation. The idea had been developing in her mind for months, crystallizing during recent cases that had required coordination between multiple jurisdictions. A regional office could provide the structure and resources necessary for effective law enforcement across vast distances and diverse communities. Would you consider staying on it as senior deputy? Joyce asked. Help me build something that could serve the territory for years to come. Hannah grinned broadly. Marshal Whitman, I would be honored to help you build the finest law enforcement agency in the Western Territories. They reached Joyce's ranch the following afternoon, arriving to find unexpected visitors waiting on the front porch. Marshal Richardson sat in conversation with a distinguished older man Joyce did not recognize. Both men rose as the women approached, Richardson with his usual professional courtesy and the stranger with obvious curiosity. Marshal Whitman, Richardson said formally, allow me to introduce Judge William Harrison from the territorial capital. He has traveled considerable distance to meet with you. Joyce dismounted and approached the porch with caution. Visits from territorial judges usually meant either commendation or investigation, and she was not sure which to expect. Judge Harrison was a tall man with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw. Marshal Whitman, Judge Harrison said, extending his hand in greeting, your reputation has reached the territorial government. We have matters of importance to discuss. Joyce invited both men inside while Hannah tended to their horses. The judge accepted coffee and settled into her front room with the air of someone accustomed to serious conversations. Richardson remained standing, suggesting that whatever was coming would require formal response. Marshal Whitman, Judge Harrison began, the territorial government has been reviewing law enforcement effectiveness across our jurisdiction. Your recent cases have demonstrated exceptional competence and innovation in difficult circumstances. Joyce waited for the other shoe to drop, knowing that praise from politicians usually preceded requests for favors or acceptance of additional responsibilities. We would like to offer you promotion to Chief Marshal for the Northern Territories, Judge Harrison continued. Full administrative authority, budget for additional personnel, headquarters location of your choosing. Essentially, we want you to build the regional law enforcement agency you have been discussing with Marshal Richardson. Joyce felt a moment of surprise. Her informal conversations about improved coordination had apparently been reported up the chain of command and taken seriously by territorial leadership. The offer was exactly what she had been considering, but with official backing and substantial resources. What would be the scope of authority, she asked carefully. Complete jurisdiction over federal crimes in the northern third of Montana Territory, Judge Harrison replied. Authority to recruit and train deputy marshals, establish procedures and protocols, coordinate with local law enforcement agencies. Essentially, you would create the structure necessary for effective law enforcement as the territory grows and develops. Joyce looked through her window toward the mountains where she had tracked countless criminals and fought numerous battles. The territory was indeed growing rapidly, with new settlements and mining operations creating opportunities for both legitimate enterprise and criminal activity. Better law enforcement was not just desirable but necessary. I accept, she said simply, with the condition that my current partner, Deputy Marshal Hannah Gonzalez, be appointed as senior deputy with full authority to act in my absence. Judge Harrison smiled with satisfaction. Already approved, Marshal Whitman. Deputy Gonzalez has impressed everyone with her rapid development and professional competence. You have trained her well. The paperwork was completed that afternoon, officially establishing the Northern Territorial Marshal Service with headquarters at Joyce's ranch. Additional buildings would be constructed to house offices, armory, and barracks for visiting deputies. The quiet homestead would become the center of law enforcement for thousands of square miles. Hannah accepted her promotion with characteristic enthusiasm, immediately beginning plans for recruitment and training programs. Joyce found herself caught between satisfaction at official recognition and concern about the changes coming to her peaceful ranch. Growth brought opportunities, but also complications. That evening, as Judge Harrison and Marshal Richardson prepared to depart, Joyce walked the boundaries of her property one final time as simple rancher and widow. Tomorrow she would begin the complex work of building a law enforcement agency from nothing, training new deputies, and coordinating justice across vast territories. Thunder nickered softly from his paddock, content in familiar surroundings despite the changes swirling around him. The stallion had started this journey by being stolen, leading Joyce back into law enforcement and ultimately to this moment of expanded responsibility. Perhaps it had all been inevitable. 6 months later, the Northern Territorial Marshal Service had grown from concept to reality. 3 additional deputies had been recruited and trained, bringing the total staff to 5 marshals covering territory from the Canadian border to the Yellowstone River. The ranch headquarters bustled with activity as reports came in from across the region, and assignments were coordinated through Central Command. Joyce stood in her new office reviewing case files and deployment schedules with Hannah at her side. The walls were covered with territorial maps marked with crime patterns, wanted posters, and communication schedules with other law enforcement agencies. What had once been a simple ranch house was now the nerve center for federal law enforcement across the Northern Territories. Deputy Marshal Scott Ramos, recently recruited from the Texas Rangers, knocked on the office door with his weekly report. The irony of his name matching one of the rustlers Joyce had captured was not lost on anyone. But this Scott Ramos was an experienced lawman with impeccable credentials and recommendations. "Chief Marshal," he said formally, "the mining camp situation near Butte is escalating. Local sheriff is requesting federal assistance with organized crime elements that appear to be operating across territorial boundaries." Joyce reviewed his written report with professional interest. Mining camps attracted criminals like honey attracted flies, providing opportunities for everything from claim jumping to organized extortion. Federal intervention was often necessary when local law enforcement became overwhelmed or corrupted. "Take Deputy Martinez with you," Joyce decided. "Full investigation, coordinate with local authorities, report back within 2 weeks. Use whatever resources you need." Scott nodded and departed to brief his partner. Joyce watched through her window as the 2 deputies prepared for departure, checking weapons and supplies with the thoroughness she had drilled into all her personnel. Professional standards were non-negotiable in her organization. Hannah studied the deployment board with satisfaction. 5 active cases across 4 districts, she observed, all major crime patterns being addressed systematically. The territory is definitely safer than it was 6 months ago. Joyce agreed but felt the weight of expanded responsibility. Success brought new challenges as word spread about the effectiveness of the Northern Territorial Marshal Service. Requests for assistance came from across the region, sometimes exceeding their capacity to respond adequately. "We need more deputies," Joyce said quietly. "At least 3 additional marshals to handle current caseload properly." The territorial government approved expansion, but finding qualified candidates remains difficult. Hannah nodded agreement. "Most experienced lawmen are already employed elsewhere, and training new deputies from scratch takes months. We need people with the right combination of skills and temperament." As if summoned by their conversation, a rider approached the ranch at steady pace. Joyce recognized Laura Ward, the newspaper editor who had interviewed her months earlier. Laura dismounted with obvious urgency, carrying a telegram that suggested important news. "Chief Marshal Whitman," Laura called. "Priority message from the territorial capital. Marked urgent and confidential." Joyce accepted the telegram with growing concern. Urgent communications usually meant either political interference or major criminal activity requiring immediate response. She read quickly, her expression growing grim as she absorbed the contents. "What is it?" Hannah asked with concern. Joyce handed her the telegram without comment. Hannah read silently, her own expression shifting to match her supervisor's mood. "Bank robbery in Helena," Hannah summarized. 3 men, professional operation, substantial theft. Governor requesting immediate federal response with full investigative authority. Joyce was already moving toward her weapons cabinet, mind shifting into operational mode. Helena was the territorial capital, center of government and commerce. A successful bank robbery there would send shockwaves across the entire territory and undermine confidence in law enforcement generally. "Saddle Thunder," she told Hannah. Full field gear for extended operations. We leave within the hour. Hannah departed immediately to prepare for travel while Joyce gathered intelligence files and communication equipment. Helena was 2 days hard riding from the ranch, but speed was essential if they hoped to pick up a trail before it went completely cold. Laura Ward lingered in the office doorway, obviously hoping for information she could use in her newspaper coverage. Joyce considered how much to reveal without compromising the investigation. Professional bank robbery suggests organized crime, Joyce said carefully, possibly connected to other recent incidents across the territory. We will coordinate with local authorities and pursue federal jurisdiction where appropriate. Laura nodded and departed to file her story. Joyce knew that newspaper coverage would spread word of the robbery quickly, possibly alerting other criminal elements to increase security or accelerate their own operations. Media attention was both helpful and problematic in law enforcement work. Joyce and Hannah departed the ranch within the planned hour, riding hard toward Helena with spare horses to maintain speed over long distances. The trail was already 36 hours old, growing colder with every passing moment. Professional bank robbers would use that time to maximum advantage, creating distance and obscuring their escape route. The ride to Helena took them through country Joyce knew intimately from her earlier career, but she saw it now with the eyes of regional law enforcement commander rather than individual marshal. Every town, every trail, every hiding place was part of a larger pattern that required systematic understanding and coordination. They reached Helena at sunset on the second day, arriving to find the territorial capital in uproar over the audacious robbery. The bank had been hit during peak business hours by three masked men who demonstrated professional planning and execution. No one was injured, but the theft exceeded $5,000 in cash and gold, a substantial loss that threatened the institution's stability. Sheriff Davis met them at the bank with obvious relief at federal involvement. The robbers had left minimal evidence and no witnesses who could provide useful descriptions. Professional job from start to finish, executed by men who knew exactly what they were doing. Joyce examined the crime scene with Hannah, noting details that local law enforcement might have missed. The robbers had disabled the bank's security measures with technical knowledge that suggested inside information or extensive preparation. They had moved through the building with efficiency that spoke of careful planning and rehearsal. Most importantly, they had escaped on fresh horses waiting at a predetermined location, suggesting support personnel and detailed logistics. This was not a desperate crime by amateurs, but a carefully orchestrated operation by professionals with substantial resources. The investigation took Joyce and Hannah across 3 counties, following a trail that grew more complex with each new piece of evidence. The bank robbers had indeed been professionals, part of a larger criminal organization that specialized in high-value targets across multiple territories. Their escape route had been planned in advance, with fresh horses and supplies cached at strategic locations. More disturbing, the investigation revealed connections to other recent crimes, including the confidence schemes Joyce had broken months earlier. The same organizational structure, the same professional methods, the same careful planning and execution. Someone was building a criminal empire across the Western territories, and the Helena Bank robbery was just the latest operation. Joyce coordinated with law enforcement agencies across 4 territories, sharing intelligence and comparing crime patterns. The picture that emerged was sobering. At least 12 major crimes over the past year, all showing similar professional characteristics and organizational sophistication. Robberies, fraud schemes, cattle rustling, and extortion operations, all apparently coordinated by a single criminal leadership. Hannah studied the evidence files with growing amazement. This is not just a gang, she observed. This is a criminal corporation with multiple divisions and specialized personnel. Whoever is running this operation has serious organizational skills. Joyce agreed grimly. The scope and sophistication of the criminal enterprise exceeded anything she had encountered during her martial career. Traditional law enforcement methods might not be sufficient against adversaries who operated like legitimate businesses with unlimited resources and territorial reach. We need federal assistance, Joyce decided. Treasury agents, military intelligence, whatever resources the territorial government can provide. This is beyond the capacity of regional marshals operating alone. The request went up through official channels to Washington, where federal authorities were increasingly concerned about organized crime in the Western territories. The response came back within weeks. A joint task force would be established with Joyce as regional coordinator, combining territorial marshals with federal agents and military intelligence personnel. The task force assembled at Joyce's ranch headquarters, bringing together law enforcement professionals from across the country, Treasury agents with experience in financial crimes, military intelligence officers familiar with organized criminal networks, and territorial marshals who knew local conditions and personalities. Leading the federal contingent was Special Agent David Chen, a Treasury Department investigator with extensive experience in organized crime cases. Joyce worked with him to establish task force procedures and coordinate the various agencies involved in the investigation. The criminal organization we are facing has characteristics similar to operations we have encountered in major eastern cities, Agent Chen explained during their first briefing. Sophisticated leadership, specialized divisions, corruption of local officials, and substantial financial resources. Traditional law enforcement methods are often inadequate against such organizations. Joyce absorbed this information with growing concern. Rural territories lack the infrastructure and resources available to urban law enforcement agencies. Fighting organized crime in the wilderness would require innovative approaches and careful coordination between multiple jurisdictions. Over the following months, the task force gradually penetrated the criminal organization through careful investigation and strategic arrests. The network proved to be even larger than initially suspected, with operations spanning from California to Colorado and north into Canada. The leadership remained elusive, protected by layers of subordinates and careful security procedures. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Thomas Morales, the confidence man Joyce had arrested in Silver Creek, agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentence. His information revealed the location of a major meeting where criminal leaders would gather to plan future operations. The meeting was scheduled for a remote valley in the Absaroka Mountains, perfect location for security-conscious criminals who wanted to avoid law enforcement surveillance. Joyce coordinated with the task force to plan a raid that would capture the criminal leadership and break the organization permanently. The operation required careful planning and precise execution. Multiple teams would approach from different directions, surrounding the valley and preventing escape while federal agents moved in for arrests. Joyce would lead the main assault team, using her knowledge of mountain terrain and tactical expertise to coordinate the raid. As dawn broke over the Absaroka Mountains, Joyce led her team into position overlooking the criminal camp. Through field glasses, she counted at least 20 men, including several she recognized from wanted posters. The entire leadership structure of the criminal organization was present, making this the opportunity to end their operations permanently. The raid went flawlessly, with multiple teams converging simultaneously to prevent escape or resistance. The criminals, caught completely by surprise, surrendered without significant fighting. Among the prisoners was the organizational leader, a man named Marcus Sullivan, who had been coordinating criminal activities across the entire western region. Sullivan proved to be a former Army officer with extensive experience in logistics and organization, skills he had applied to building a criminal empire. His capture and the seizure of detailed records broke the back of the organized crime networks and led to dozens of additional arrests across multiple territories. The success of the task force operation established Joyce's reputation as one of the most effective law enforcement commanders in the Western Territories. Requests for assistance came from across the region, and the Northern Territorial Marshal Service became the model for organized law enforcement in frontier conditions. But success brought new challenges and responsibilities that sometimes felt overwhelming. Joyce found herself spending more time on administration and coordination than on direct law enforcement, managing budgets and personnel rather than tracking criminals across open country. One evening, as she reviewed reports in her office while Hannah handled field operations, Joyce realized how much her life had changed since Thunder's theft had forced her back into law enforcement. The quiet widow who had wanted only to train horses and maintain her ranch was gone, replaced by someone who commanded federal agents and coordinated operations across multiple territories. The transformation was necessary and important, but it was also exhausting in ways that simple marshal work had never been. Leadership required different skills and imposed different burdens than individual law enforcement. Joyce sometimes missed the clarity and directness of tracking criminals alone across wilderness terrain. Hannah knocked on her office door with the evening reports, interrupting Joyce's reflections on the costs of success. The younger woman had grown into an exceptional deputy and administrator, handling routine operations with competence that freed Joyce to focus on larger strategic issues. All teams reporting successful completion of assigned operations, Hannah announced with satisfaction. 3 arrests in the Billings district, 2 fugitives apprehended near Missoula, and the cattle rustling investigation in the Bitterroot Valley is proceeding ahead of schedule. Joyce accepted the reports with professional satisfaction, tempered by personal wariness. The Northern Territorial Marshal Service was operating at peak efficiency, but the demands of command were taking their toll on her personal life and peace of mind. Perhaps it was time to consider succession planning and gradual transition to less demanding responsibilities. Hannah was ready for increased authority, and other deputies were developing the skills necessary for independent operations. Joyce could step back without compromising the organization's effectiveness. But not yet. The territory still needed strong leadership and experienced guidance as it continued growing and developing. Criminal elements would always threaten honest settlers and legitimate businesses, requiring constant vigilance and professional response. The work was too important to abandon prematurely. Joyce walked to her window and looked out across the ranch toward mountains, where she had fought so many battles and pursued so many criminals. The land looked peaceful in evening light, but she knew that peace was maintained only through strength and determination to defend it against those who would exploit weakness. Tomorrow would bring new cases and fresh challenges, requiring the skills and experience she had developed over years of law enforcement. The quiet widow was gone forever, but the marshal remained, evolved into something larger and more effective than she had ever imagined possible. Thunder nickered softly from his paddock, the sound carrying clearly in evening air. The stallion that had started this journey by being stolen was now content in his familiar surroundings, protected by the reputation and capabilities of the woman who had refused to let his theft go unpunished. Justice had been served, order maintained, and the territory made safer through professional law enforcement. It was enough. It was everything.